Hello and welcome to the Impactful Conversations podcast with me, Dr. Glenn Wallace, and my very dear friend and co-host, Nejmi Alexander. Nejmi, hi mate, how are you?
I am very well, thank you. Very well, Glenn. Looking forward to getting into this idea of decision velocity. It's most
Yeah, and me too, because I think one of the reasons that we're looking at the speed and the rate at which decisions are made in organizations is because it seems a real challenge for the organization, for our leaders rather, that we're talking with inside the organizations that we are liaising with on a regular basis. And there seems to be pressure on individual leaders to make decisions. There seems to be frustration about the pace at which decisions either are made or aren't made by different levels of the organization. So it's a real thing. And I think rather than this be about how the tactics or the technical ways of making a decision, it's about looking broadly at what's the right speed for decisions to be made, bearing in mind the context in which they're being played out, I think. And how do you do that in a way that mitigates risk, but also makes the decisions made and completed in a reasonable time frame? Because when we're coaching individual leaders, that's very much where the center of gravity of those conversations seems to be.
Yeah. I mean, just a couple of ideas that come to mind. I mean, we haven't defined it yet, so we'll get into defining it. But a couple of ideas that come to mind around where this, as an idea becomes really tangible that people might relate to. Certainly for me, this idea of urgency that in leadership, certainly to a person, that there's just a high degree of pace and urgency that people are working towards typically. And what relationship does that have towards this kind of system of decision velocity within an organization or within your context? We can sort of think about that in time to come, but also um this maybe it's around sort of uncertainty, that actually when we are experiencing uncertainty, AI uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, that can actually have then an impact on, um, again, this dynamic of feeling this urgency or need to make decisions or operate with a
Yeah.
velocity. But sometimes that can be a frustration because
Yeah.
things do not move quickly.
Yeah, 100%. And I think if you and I were talking before we came on air, but I've spoken with tens of leaders in the even since the start of this year, and reflecting on last year, many of them would say that that uncertainty in the geopolitical situation in the middle of last year, with the tariff conversations that were going on globally, meant that decision making slowed down inside an organization. And I think part of the reason for that slowdown is that it's to your point, it was the lack of clarity meant that those decisions, it was harder to make those decisions. Not only that, but then you wrap more people into the decision making process. So you've got more resource being drawn into making the decision. And by the way, a byproduct of that is that those decisions then take longer often too, because you've got to get consensus. So
Yeah.
there are so many things, elements that play through to the velocity with which a decision can be made. Some of them outside of people's control. I think what we're trying to do today is help individual leaders think about how do they keep the decision velocity at the right rate for the
Yeah.
decision that needs to be made, and what sorts
Yeah.
of things might they need to consider.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Nice. So there are external factors that can impact. We'll recognize that some of the symptoms of that or some of the frustrations that can cause, but actually for a leader, this idea not demand velocity, decision velocity,
Yeah.
actually is an idea of of looking at some things that might be controllable, or some things that you can be intentional around in order to drive things at the right pace,
Yes.
without creating the sort of chaos, or feeding into the chaos, or lack of clarity, or any of those sort of byproducts when decision velocity is not operating at the right pace.
Yeah, and the flip side is if you get that right more often than you don't, there's a strategic advantage, a competitive advantage to doing that, right? Which is you can make the right decision more often at the right pace, and that will translate into competitive advantage. Now, who's not interested in that, right? So, there's a real upside, or there are real upsides, plural, probably, to being able to do this well.
Yeah. Okay. So it feels like maybe we've defined it, but for clarity,
Hmm.
what do we mean when we say decision velocity? What are the different components to be aware of as a leader?
Yeah, I think decision velocity is a function of um, clarity, the commitment to the decision itself, because I think that impacts sort of engagement in the discussion, even, or the governance element to it, maybe, and then actually the speed with which you are willing to act or to compute all the different variables in order to make decisions. So I think it's speed, clarity, and commitment would give you the relevant velocity that decision's going to be made through, I guess, that lens.
Got it. Okay. All right. So just to be to make sure that I'm on the right page then. So when we talk about speed, clarity, and commitment, what we're saying is that as a leader in any given context or any given decision that's required to be made, those components, it's important to be clear, well, intentional around how you know, how you either create those components in your context or react to those components to ensure that you're making a decision at the right speed for whatever the situation is. If it's something that requires more engagement, more time, more people involved, then you're making the right judgment call around that and you're operating accordingly. Or the converse, if it's just at your level and it's within your gift to decide on it, that you can move quite quickly, making that, being able to kind of make a savvy decision, a sound judgment around the speed at which the decision could be made, the clarity around it, that you're able to ensure that whoever needs to be involved is involved to the extent that everybody's clear on their input and clear on the decision, so that they can act in accordance to that decision. And then, yeah, which is aligned to that commitment idea, that you've actually, created, that you've got the right people in the room to agree and get behind whatever the decision is, so that they can then go and do their part to turn whatever that decision is into an action. And when you can get those three things right and you're judging that correctly, you can create less of the, I don't know, byproduct of not getting that right.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think those byproducts would be decision making that's too slow, and you've made the wrong decision about the decision. I think it lends itself to higher quality decision making at the right speed, and the right speed might be really slow, by the way. So we don't want people to go away with this idea that it's about every decision has to be made faster. That's definitely not what we're saying. It's the right speed for the right decision. And I think we've worked with leaders, because we talked about it offline, so I know we have, which is, where they seem to be paralyzed around key decisions. Well, that's what you're being paid for. Part of what you're being paid for is to make tough calls. Or we know leaders who always want a team around them to make decisions, and you sort of think, well, decision making by committee is really important in some contexts, really not in others. And if your default is always to go to the committee, you're probably slowing things down, versus the sort of hero leader type model, which is, yeah, I know, I know what's the right choice is, and I've made the decision, and then you've not engaged enough people. So I think it's a really, when we work with leaders and you ask them to reflect on their decision-making style, very often that's a real eye-opener to them. It's around whether actually I ask everybody to help me make decisions because I lack confidence, or whether actually I'm not very good at engaging people and have relatively low EQ, so I don't tend to engage enough people. I'm just giving some real examples of how that plays through. Get it right though, and personally your own leadership career goes up, but so does that competitive advantage we spoke about earlier on.
Yeah. It feels to me there's what comes to life for me around this idea is that there's very much the individual lens, which is how do I exactly what you just described. You know, how do I interpret where I have authority? How do I just make take risks sometimes and just make the decision where it's necessary or where I, you know, where I do feel like this sits within my authority. How
Mm.
well and effectively do I, you know, gain influence or you know, create engagement with things that I need to drive forward. All of those things around personal leadership, which can show up in a whole variety of different, you know, ways. You know, driving through change or you know, being able to deliver on some of your outcomes, even just operating at the right pace, um, can come into that as a topic. And but then there's also the contextual lens as well, right? The environmental lens, like how hierarchical
Yeah.
is the organization? How effectively does authority get delegated through the organization or not? Sometimes there's a facade of that, and actually, you know, what one person might have thought was their decision is not really the decision, and so that can also play its part in slowing down that decision velocity as well, or not getting it right consistently. Um, on the individual side of things, you know, where do you feel that leaders can sometimes sort of get stuck, perhaps around that framework that we've described? You know, sort of speed
Yeah.
and clarity and commitment.
I, okay. So I think there's several, but top of mind, there are I would say two or three things that we see quite regularly when we coach very senior leaders. Um, One is that they are activists, so actually they want to crack on before they've got all of the details to hand. So the clarity piece isn't where it needs to be, and so they'll actually start doing things. I don't know, and there could be a limitless number of what those things are, but around the decision, they're starting to maybe to gather people before they've really understood what is it that this decision requires, you know, of me, and what is the decision to be made. So I think there's the tendency to act is one trap that leaders can definitely fall into. I think the second is not being strategic enough. So actually, that you take it, the material that you've got to make a decision on kind of face value, and that's it. And actually, you don't do enough of the scoping of the landscape to see what type of decision is this, you know, who's going to be impacted by it, where's the information or the request for the decision come from, what might their motivations be. And so I think there's that as well, which is again leaders who are very inward looking but don't look up and out sufficiently frequently, to have enough of the relevant data. I'm not a fan of gather all the data all the time because not all decisions need that. But I do honestly think that because people are often so busy, they don't look up and out often enough. So I think that would be the second one. And then I would say, I've hinted at it already, there are some personal biases or personal traits that can get in the way of making the right decision at the right speed. And that might be things like lack of confidence, um, uh, things like being a bit too individualistic and not collaborative enough. That idea that you're sort of you're, you know, impersonating a leader rather than being a real leader, that kind of idea. And so I think there are some of those personal things. So I would say, at least off the top of my head, there would be three things that are pretty common: personal
Yeah.
traits and biases, not looking up and out enough, and often just cracking on before you've kind of really got all the detail that you need.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely bang on. For me, the biggest trap or the one that I come across the most often is in that clarity kind of bucket,
Yeah.
of not getting the full picture before like moving forward, or not fully understanding the different interests at play, that can, derail a decision if you go ahead without having gotten the right clarity around the decision itself. Effectively, you could be creating a lot more activity around the task, from like re-engaging stakeholders, solving for some political storms, S storms, or otherwise described storms, that can happen around trying to reverse a decision when it had
Yeah.
it's sort of thinking at it from a risk perspective, actually not getting that clarity up front around what the decision is, whether you're the right, the decision does truly sit with you, or who needs to contribute towards the thinking for that decision. That, I mean, is the biggest derailer. Almost like the speed at which the decision can be made, in my mind, can be a function of that. Once you properly understand that, then you
Yeah.
can make decisions at the right speed, and also the commitment around that decision as well tends to find itself at the right level once the other sort of two components are present. I feel like that's an easier bit to
Yeah,
solve.
that's a good. Yeah, that's a really good, because what something that you've just sparked for me, Nejmi, as you were speaking around the commitment thing is, once leaders have made a decision, yeah, I think there's something there about, you've got to back yourself, haven't you? You've got to commit to that decision. You can't go half-hearted at it once the decision's been made. I think it sends all the wrong messages to people. And certainly if you're then, part the way through it and you're sort of, umming and ahhing about it, or indeed you're trying to sort of shed the blame if the wheels look like they're going to come off, and you think, no, that's the role of a leader. Sometimes you get those decisions wrong. I think one of the things we would be true from the outputs of this conversation is, there's no guarantee that the decision that you've made is right. It's just, was it the best decision that you could make at the right speed, and once you've made it, commit to it. Because if it was the right one, you've got more chance of it, turning out okay. If you're prevaricating around the edges and not committing, I think that sends all the wrong messages, um,
Yeah,
and almost become. I suppose you could argue it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy then.
it's really fascinating, isn't it? Like within the idea of having all the data, right? I come across this often where clients will who are maybe more risk averse, just in their personality style, or their appetite for risk is relatively low, but find themselves in leadership situations, or in situation, any situation really, where you're required to make a decision without having the full picture or full data set, right? Which is all the time, because none of us
Yeah.
can predict the future. And actually, when that's the case, we can over-index on a desire for slowing things down in order to
Yeah.
get more information, with the intent that more information is going to make you feel more comfortable with taking a risk. Actually, the risk probably, your comfort levels around taking that risk probably won't shift.
Yeah.
It's just maybe slightly increase the probability of you making the right decision. But actually, if it like, from a purely hypothetical standpoint, if you've got two decisions, if there's one or two options, there's one out of two options to take. You only need 51% of
Yeah.
the data
Yeah.
or the insight or
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
conceptually that you can imagine for it to tip in that favor. And then that is the right decision with the information that you had at
Yeah.
hand. Now that won't make you feel comfortable to take that risk. But you're not going to get a better, you might get 5-10% more of the data by slowing things down. But
Yeah.
it's not going to swing in the other way's favor.
No, and the danger is then you're moving at the wrong speed. So you've got
Exactly.
greater clarity, but you're actually then working at the wrong speed, so you haven't got the right decision velocity. It reminds me, if we move into some sort of practical tools for
Yeah.
leaders to help them with this kind of, choosing the right speed at the right time kind of thing. What it reminds me of, what you've just said, is when I was doing my doctoral studies, we had to do, as is true of all sort of degree type theses, I guess, a literature review. And the guidance was that you do your literature review until you reach a point called what that was referred to as saturation. And what that meant is that you are continue to read all the time that fresh information is coming up. When actually what you're finding is that mostly you're rereading things that you've already read or you're already aware of, then you've reached saturation and you've probably done as deep a dive in the literature review as is needed.
Yeah.
And although I'm not suggesting that people go to those lengths, certainly not with all decisions, I do think that's a useful guide, that idea of saturation. Have I got all the information and largely I'm not finding anything new? There's always going to be outliers. There are always going to be new information coming forward. But at some point, you've got to say, I've got a deadline for this decision. Have I reached as much saturation as I can get, for this decision in that time? I've used that a lot, I have to say, in my career. And it probably means, if anything, I've made decisions slightly more slowly than would be ideal, but it's given me the confidence in knowing that I've got as much information as I could find in the context. I hope
Yeah.
that's a useful tool for people, that idea of saturation.
Yeah, I love that. There's it makes me think of the Pareto from my own from I was like, oh, university, I remember studying. Feels like years ago, but from my own sort of background, the Pareto efficiency rule, which
Yeah,
is brought it to the other end of the spectrum. That actually, I think it's around you will likely have achieved 80% of the insight from 20% of the time,
yeah,
from the first 20% of the time, and so the remaining effort that you can do can of course increase your insight, increase your confidence, but you've got significantly diminishing returns on all of
yeah,
the time then that follows that first sort of initial tranche, that maybe that high level analysis or whatever it might be.
yeah,
And so if you're operating at pace, just asking yourself, what is the 20%? Like, how will I know when setting yourself a mental
yeah,
Moodle for what's the first 20% of information that I could gather around this decision, or what do I
yeah,
need to know? The first order of magnitude, um,
yeah, yeah.
and then deciding beyond that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think linked to that would be another tool would be actually to put a self-imposed time limit on it. So I'm going to give 48 hours to make the decision, or maybe 24 hours to find the information that I need. But again, that will depend on context and it will depend on the scale of the decision. But choose the right timeline, but don't make it endless. Because to your point, if largely you're going to find 80% of what you need in the first 20%, but I would make it shorter rather than longer,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah,
So I think we've got saturation on the one end, we've got the 80-20 rule on another, we've got the kind of 48-hour rule, let's call it that, but you can make the time whatever feels right for the decision itself. Any other kind of sort of tactics for people to think about?
on the idea of like risk aversion,
Hmm.
which, as we know, can crop up around that idea again. A pitfall that people can fall into is maybe confidence to take a decision, maybe the risk around getting it wrong, or somebody turning around and pointing the finger at some point that can really significantly slow down
Yeah.
decision velocity. A really useful tool that I have employed with numerous clients over the years is around this idea of fear setting. And fear setting is about looking at what's the worst case scenario. So often we over index on inaction because of fear of something happening. But typically it's subconscious, or it might be driven from, previous narratives that are not relevant in this context. But nonetheless, slow us down or make us more averse to making a decision. And when that's true, a really useful tool for unraveling that is actually exploring what the reality of the likelihood or impact is of the worst case scenario
Mm,
showing its.
mm,
And so a really simple tool around fear setting is like just taking yourself mentally through that process to bring it to life and then make a decision around it. So on that topic, imagining for any decision, if I get it wrong, what's the worst
yeah.
case scenario? Like what do I imagine in the absolute worst of worst situations could happen in this situation? Uh, and what's the likelihood of that happening? Put a percentage on it, score it from 1 to 10 or whatever it might be. And if once you've kind of analyzed that, probably acknowledge that it's really unlikely, and I should probably act accordingly. But if we want to go further into making that more tangible, looking at what it, if the worst case were to happen,
Yep.
what irredeemable or irreversible impact would that have, if any? Chances are none, but explore it. And what would you do to get yourself back on track if that were to happen? And actually taking yourself through that process to explore that helps to, again, bring that idea to life, acknowledge that it's in likelihood of the things we're worried about happening are infinitesimally small, but nonetheless it's useful to explore that, bring it into focus, and then make a decision around it. Once you're aware of the thing that you're fearful of, what do you want to do with that information? And that helps to sort of unblock a lot of action,
Yeah.
which I found really useful at times.
Yeah. Yeah, really cool. Last thing I will say, just to finish this off, because you prompted me to this word, which is reversible versus irreversible. I think there's some real, even just as a first stab, if you look at the decision and categorize it, is it reversible? In which case, it's relatively low stakes and you can make those decisions much more quickly. If it's irreversible, then you want to probably take more time and go into greater depth with the research and the commitment side of things. So I think that's a really useful categorization tool. And then if you layer over the top of that, how political is the decision, and that can be reversible or irreversible, that adds another layer of dynamic in there. But I think that's another useful just tip for people to take away. When you're first asked to make a decision that feels quite big, you can do all the things we've talked about, but also just start by thinking, is this going to be irreversible if I make it, or reversible? How's that going to impact how I engage with the decision itself? Might be helpful too.
I love that.
Cool.
Okay, some really practical tools then for helping to think about, what can you do to judge the right speed around decisions? What clarity do you need to be able to make the decision, or clarity on what the right decision even is? And then beyond that, what can you do to be committed to, or to drive commitment to said decision? Getting all of those things right means moving at the right velocity for your context, and you've got some brilliant tools there to help in that endeavor.
Cool. Great stuff. I really enjoyed that. I hope people find that helpful. I think the most important thing to take away is if you're a leader or a manager in an organization, that is it's part of your job. So getting better at it, not just the technical bits of what the decision making process is, but the way to make the right speed of decision is a key part of your role. And if you do it well, more often than not, then that's good for you. It'll be good for your business. So hopefully we'll have helped people, made an impact in that way,
Really,
positive impact.
that's what we aim for.
Awesome.
All right, thanks so much, Tim.
See you on the next one. Take care.
Cheers. Bye.